But you can speak to them and say, this is why you're wrong. This is really what the issue's about. Like immigration, it's not about race. I'm not going to spend my life being a color. Thank you, MJ. Thank you, Michael Jackson. I'm not either. So in that, I want us to understand what the issue is about, which is about having our law, our border, those who come to our country to assimilate and be an American without hyphens, as opposed to being a manipulated class based on identity politics. Because nobody really wants that. That's not recognizing us as individuals. That's recognizing us as voting blocks and having a government take over where God is, and quite frankly, and the state determining what you do and how you do it and how much you should make and what's good for you. And I think you have a dream. So in understanding that, I bring you Dr. Stephen Camarata. He is the Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies. And when I read up on these subjects, which I oftentimes do, I read his work. And so every time I get to talk to him, I just think it's so cool. How are you, buddy?
Great. Thanks for having me back.
Always. Hey, I want to play this clip. It's about 2 minutes, but it's a great back and forth, and then you're going to explain it to us because it's Laura Ingraham versus George Will. And normally I rarely play somebody else, a talk show host. I know Laura's great. I have a great deal of respect, but what I love about this is how the debate goes, because I think it illustrates and is a great example of how things go when we're trying to have a conversation about immigration reform and amnesty. And here is Laura Ingraham, George Will, Juan Williams, and the great Chris Wallace. Roll it.
Three needs the country has. The welfare state needs its workforce replenished as the elderly retire. 10,000 baby boomers every day becoming eligible for Social Security and Medicare. Second, there's an intense global competition for human capital, and we're losing out on that. Third, to immigrate is to make an entrepreneurial act. It's to uproot yourself and perhaps your family and take a risk, and those are the kind of people I want more of.
Do we care about American workers at all? And their jobs and their wages and their dreams?
Laura, you're the one who's arguing the AFL-CIO argument, which is...
They're for it.
Oh, but they're for it with so many caveats they nullify.
But why not?
You're arguing,
why have borders?
You're arguing the zero-sum game that we have. When in the lives of our children and grandchildren, there are 500 million Americans, and they're all going to be working because we're going to have economic dynamism aided by immigration.
So the argument, though, however, it leads to why have borders at all? Why have a border? If it's just about people as widgets who come in and are workers without really a concern about assimilation, without concern about how it affects people in middle America. I mean, a lot of people who are in favor of this don't send their kids to public schools, are not affected by illegal immigration at all. But I would submit that there are people who are watching this show right now who are screaming at the top of their lungs saying, who in Washington is representing my interests? The labor shortage argument that Paul Ryan is making, that we have an impending labor shortage, I think transparently it is ridiculous to most people today. We don't have participation in the workforce as it is.
It's not a shortage, it's growth we want. We don't want to fit...
Well, then we can talk about legal immigration, not illegal immigration.
You talk about the borders. As you know, 40% of all the people here illegally
Visa
overstayed their visas.
Why don't we crack down on that, then?
Go ahead and crack down, but that's still compatible.
We don't want to crack down on it. There's no will to enforce the border. There is no faith in this administration to do it, and the Republican elites and the Democrat elites agree, and the people are revolting across this country.
Deportation at a record level?
All right. Now, you see how that happened at the end there? They were just on the labor discussion, and then it shifted to deportation, and then it goes, it goes so many different ways we go with this. And, Stephen, this would be my dream show. Will versus Ingraham, and then I get to interview you. So I'm having kind of a dream show right now. Let me ask you this. Labor shortage, the recipe for growth that George Will is speaking of, intellectual capital, understanding the dynamism that is created by immigration. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's just a lot of platitudes. Let's take the issue of a labor shortage. If we have a labor shortage, we should see some sign of it in the data, right? Right now, we've got, just look at the native-born population, we've got about 50 million 18 to 65-year-olds not working. It's a record. No improvement in 5 years. The share not working, 1 out of 3 working-age native-born Americans right now is not working. As recently as 2000, it was 1 out of 4. We have a situation in terms of the labor force participation or the employment rate, the share of people actually holding a job, are at record lows. The number not working is at record highs. The second piece of data you would look at to find a labor shortage is wages, right? In economics, if something is in short supply, the price of that thing, whether it's wheat or steel or cars, the price goes up. The price of labor or the price of workers is wages. Real wages for workers with a college education, with some college, with only a high school education, and high school dropouts have been flat for well over a decade. Everybody agrees on that. The only piece of evidence we have a labor shortage is testimonials from owners of business that want to bring in more foreign workers. That's it. All the data the government collects shows no labor shortage, and that's generally true at the bottom end, where we're talking about janitors, maids, and busboys, or if we're talking about computer programmers, engineers, and mathematicians. There's been no wage growth generally for anybody. How can you have a shortage of something when for more than a decade you don't have a price increase? It's very hard to reconcile that.
Well,
Just on the labor shortage argument,
right, go ahead.
it is the evidence is so overwhelming. We have a surplus of labor.
Okay, if we have a surplus of labor, you're saying that businesses recognize that and they say, you know what, we have a surplus, but if I can import more labor, that will lower my costs because I don't have to pay them as much?
Right, a couple of factors. One is if you increase the supply of anything, so if you're talking about janitors, maids, busboys, or computer programmers, it doesn't really matter. If I can increase the supply of it, it tends to push down the price of that thing. And so the way employers see it is, look, if I've got 10 people applying for the job or 20, 20's better. You generally have to pay less. So it's also possible that the immigrants come in and work for less. But the main effect would just be to increase the supply of labor. But it's also that they might come in and work for less, or just the threat that you would turn to foreign labor also might help keep wages in check as well. And other factors have also led to this situation, which is a long sociological discussion. But very briefly, one of the things that used to happen in the low-wage labor market is employers had a whole network of people. They knew guidance counselors at the local high school or counselors at the local community college or a minister at the local church who could help hook them up with some reliable kids if they needed summer help at their construction site or at their or any place, whether it was a restaurant or a hotel. And those employers use those informal mechanisms of family and friends and institutions in the society. All that has largely atrophied in high immigration areas, and what employers have come now to rely on is the social networks of the immigrants themselves. So if the supervisor at the warehouse is an immigrant and the employer wants to hire more people at the warehouse, he just tells his supervisor and everyone in that supervisor's apartment building and an extended family and so forth. And so the employer has now come to think about recruitment of new workers in that way and turned away from the traditional way in which he used to find people. That fact, and employers are just really used to paying low wages. We know that take a really unpleasant job like meat and poultry processing. Those jobs pay about half, that's what I say, half what they used to in 1980. And the employers are just accustomed to that. They expect to be able to find people that cut up dead animals in cold conditions, very tough job, for very low wages, whereas 20, 30 years ago they would never expect that. But now that they use the immigrant labor and they use the immigrant networks, they've come to expect that. So to ask them to shift away and pay more and treat workers better, just alien to them at this point. They don't even think in those terms.
How big of issue or part of this discussion is assimilation?
Well, that's a really good point. I would take issue with one other thing Will said. There's no evidence that immigration by itself significantly increases the income of natives. What it generally does is shift income around. It generally lowers wages for workers in competition with the immigrants, but it should increase returns on capital, that is, profits for employers, and it might also increase wages for those workers not in competition with immigrants. The concern there is that the people most in competition generally are the poorest and least advantaged. But there's no evidence that it substantially raises the income or per capita gross national product of the existing population of natives. On the question of assimilation, there's some very troubling trends. As you may know, there's a researcher at Hudson Institute named John Fonte, and he's done these great surveys where, and Harris Polling did it for him, where he asked the immigrants all kinds of questions about patriotic assimilation. Just to give you one example, when he asked immigrants, and these were naturalized citizens, so not only were they legal immigrants, but they had become citizens, so they'd taken that extra step, he asked them, do you think American schools should teach kids to be proud to be an American? Whereas it was like 85% of native-born Americans said, sure, they should teach them that way. Only 50%, half of the immigrants thought that. Now, that is extremely troubling and very difficult to explain because, remember, we're not talking about illegal immigrants here. We're not talking about even just a green card holder who's living here but hasn't become a citizen. We're talking about someone who's a naturalized U.S. citizen, and yet there was this sort of sense that, no, it really wasn't all that important to teach kids to love America. And he had other results like that. And that, he concluded, and I think it's a fair conclusion, that our system of patriotic assimilation is broken, and one of the reasons is the enormous level of immigration. Someone like George Will doesn't even think about that question, but it's powerful and it's important. Right now, about 1 out of every 9 U.S. residents, about 42 million people, is foreign-born. For adults, it's about 1 out of every 8. So we're talking about an enormous number of people. And of that 42 million, about 31 million are legal immigrants. Most immigrants are legal. The enormous wave of immigration we've seen in the last 4 decades is mostly legal. And the issues in terms of the impact on schools and the labor market is, of course, much more a legal immigration question because illegal immigrants are much more numerous. And the question is, should we continue that? We take in about 1 million new legal immigrants every year. That's permanent, and more than 500,000 temporary workers and long-term visitors. That's sort of the H-1B program, the foreign students, foreign workers, that sort of thing. It's a pretty enormous level of immigration, and I should point out that the bill that passed the Senate wants to double all that. They take the number of green cards up from 1 to 2 million a year, and the number of guest workers up to well over 1 million a year. So that's in addition to legalizing illegal immigrants. And this is all at a time of stagnant wages and the worst rates of work that we've seen in America.
Stephen, what about the question, just moments remaining, but the question is always put, well, what are you going to do with the people already here?
Well, first off, there's no urgency that we have to address this tomorrow. We have to solve everything. The fact is, let's start by showing we're serious about enforcing the law. We have to control the border. We have to require employers to verify that their workers are legal. They're already required to collect the information. We have to monitor the arrival and departure of people and make sure people don't overstay their visas. We have to make sure that localities don't have sanctuary policies, that states are not giving driver's licenses and in-state tuition to illegal immigrants. Once we've done all that and we've shown that we're serious about actually enforcing our law, then we can decide whether we want to amnesty some part of the illegal immigrant population. And first off, we have to be honest. It is an amnesty. We don't want to lie to the public. But maybe we should do it for people who came at young ages. Maybe we should do it for people who have U.S.-born children who've started school. Maybe we should do it for people who've been here for more than 20 years. I think that's a discussion we could have after maybe half a decade of actually enforcing the law.
I just wish I had George Will right here. You all would have a wonderful conversation going back and forth, and we'd all benefit. But we benefited from you analyzing it and giving us the truth as you always do. Great job, man. Director of Research for the Center for Immigration Studies, CIS.org, Dr. Stephen Camarata. Stephen, thanks, man. Great to be with you.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Always. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. We got a lot of mo. Thank you, Mr. T. A lot of mo on the flip side. AFR Talk. Nothing but truth. AFR Talk.